Lynn Fisher. I'm a designer, developer, and occasional illustrator. I live in Chandler, Arizona, which is actually right there. I don't know if any of you have been to Chandler or to Arizona, but actually earlier this year I joined the team at And Yet, whose headquarters are there in a small town in eastern Washington. We have team members scattered all over the US and in Europe. And this is actually one of the reasons I love designing for the web. Basically, you can collaborate with people all over the world. And like essentially, like you could build an app completely with people you've never met before, which is like pretty insane and like a really cool world that we live in. So like a lot of you, I taught myself how to build websites when I was a kid, just kind of for fun as a hobby. It wasn't until after college that I realized that you could do this as a living, and it was kind of like, you know, a mind-blowing experience. And so I started working as a developer, and then kind of a couple years later switched into more of a designer role. And I say it like that because that's kind of what I focused on during those periods, and I guess that's how it makes sense, like organizational charts and job titles. But looking back, I realized I was doing design and development all the time, and it's been really hard for me to separate the two. And it's weird for me like where I fit into organizations sometimes, because a lot of companies see design and development like this. Where design and dev are basically two separate groups. Sometimes they're like divided organizationally or even like physically in different cities or buildings. And they're often seen as like two separate steps in a process where like the designers do their work and then they like hand off assets to a developer and then they do their work, which is fine if that works well, but that's usually not the case. Like in reality, it actually tends to look a little bit more like this, or like this, or a lot of times it actually looks like this, where the designer and the developer are the same person. This happens a lot with freelancers and small teams, and like with client-side work especially, like the line between design and development can blur and basically become non-existent. So the title of my talk is Developers as Intentional Designers, and I use the word intentional purposefully because like I've worked with a lot of designers and a lot of developers in the past, and in like my past two jobs, developers outnumbered designers pretty significantly. But as like more and more I realized that developers actually do a lot of design work. Like even though they like will adamantly say that they don't, or they don't like they think they are like terrible designers, but they do a lot of it. And the truth is, like a lot of the practices that make you a good developer also make you a good designer. So really what I want to talk about is developers deciding to be designers and designing with purpose and on purpose. And I know what you might be thinking, like there's a lot of talk in the industry right now about like hybrids and about like unicorns and like basically like magical people that can do like everything, or like lots of different things. And that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. Like obviously I'm in support of like cross-discipline work. And I do want to say that like in my ideal world, if I was like building a team from scratch, I would definitely want like a badass designer and a badass developer, like ones that can work really well together and collaborate. I've experienced this firsthand, and it is kind of like this, like magic and rainbows. Like that's awesome. Like you can support each other, and like each person gets to work with his or her own strengths, and that's really good. Like because specialization is good. Basically, people are able to practice, learn, and gain experience through doing a thing a lot, and that pushes projects to be better. It makes sure that like various priorities are being attended to in the right with the right attention. And sometimes this actually leads to conflict, but conflict is a good thing too. Like conflicting priorities is actually a good thing. Or I guess it should be like constructive conflict, right? So here's a scenario you might be familiar with. Like a designer has a really awesome idea for like a really effective visual treatment that like would potentially like solve a problem that your users are struggling with, or it could increase conversions and ultimately your revenue. But the implementation of that is like super complicated, or it'll take like months or like several $1,000s more than you have, right? That happens. Or like in some cases it's like not even possible. Like the browsers don't even support that kind of functionality. And so what do you do? Like obviously every project's different, and so I don't necessarily have a solution for that, but I do want to say that like it would be a mistake to avoid these types of conflicts. Like problems like this are what spawn like innovative solutions in our industry. Like the classic example is like designers were pushing for like drop shadows and like rounded corners on their designs for years when implementing them was like a huge pain in the ass. And now, like CSS3 box shadows and like border radius exists, right? Like, so conflict is a good thing. Like, good things come out of conflict. But sometimes it is just you. Sometimes you're the designer and the developer. And it might be because you want to be, which is awesome, or it might be because you just have to be. Like, you don't have enough money to hire a designer, or you're looking for the right designer. Like, I know hiring designers can be really tough. And so you're designing things. And so you might find yourself saying, sorry, I'm not a designer, but here's what I've been working on, right? Like, I've heard this a lot. Tons of developers say this, like when they introduce their work that they've done design on. And I totally understand it, I get it, but moving forward, I'm gonna ask that all of you stop apologizing. If you're designing things, like, be a designer, be an intentional designer. So ask any designer basically now, then they'll totally agree with you that design isn't just about the way something looks. There's a big push in the design community now to say, like, hey, there's so much more that goes into the design process than just like making things like look pretty. And the final interface is what like you consider to be the work of the designer, but there's a lot of things that designers value and things that they practice to make their process really effective. And as you may have guessed, these skills and practices are what make you a great developer also. So you already have the skills, or at the very least, you're like in the right mindset to like develop those skills further. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit quickly about practices and translating them from development to design. So modularity and reusability, you guys know all about this. You know, writing code and building systems is super complex, and especially large-scale applications. Like, you want things to be modular. You want to be able to maintain them. Like for adding or removing features, like you don't want to like touch something over here and have it like totally break something over here. Modularity like reduces dependencies, hopefully reduces complexity in your work. And as things are modular, they also become reusable. So features and functionality can be dropped into like a completely separate part of your app or into some other app that someone's writing like across the ocean. And this actually translates to almost like really perfectly to design. Like when you're designing an interface, it actually turns out there's a lot of pieces you need to style, things like text, buttons, forms, ads, and all various states of these things. And so when you're designing, you want to be able to reuse these pieces to make your work easier, quicker, and to have a consistent visual language. So like, let's say you're designing like a call out or an advertisement or something that goes on like the main page of your website. Even though that's where it's going right now, doesn't mean that's where it should go or that it's the only place it will go. You essentially want to create it so that you could drop it into like another page or an email blast or something like that. And with responsive design, like it's even more important. You're not designing pages, you're designing features that work in dynamic layouts. This might be a sort of a tangent, I don't know, but like developers are pretty familiar with the mantra of like don't repeat yourself. And I think that this actually works like really perfectly for developers, but it doesn't translate quite right to designers. And like they definitely understand what it means, like don't duplicate your work, but the semantics aren't quite right. Designers are trained to use repetition to their advantage, like to guide and reinforce user behavior. And so that's why I use the term reuse and reusability. It might seem like a little silly word thing, but I think that also like speaking the same language with designers is like really crucial for collaboration. So yeah, designing for modularity and reusability. Awesome, you got that. And a natural result of this is consistency. If you work on a dev team, if you're not by yourself, like you know that consistency can be your best friend. Like the more hands that go into the development project can make it like super messy and complicated. And like even adding a single developer onto your project can be really problematic if things aren't consistent. Like inconsistencies can make things really hard. Even small things like indentation, curly braces, semicolons, variances in that can slow you down and confuse people. So I have a lot of developer friends who will just argue about how many spaces to use for indentation, and they'll argue about it for like forever. I don't have an opinion, so I'll just put this up there too. But regardless of what they choose, they'll all like adamantly agree that it needs to be consistent everywhere. So this attitude is really awesome. Consistency in interface design is super crucial also, but I don't think we even talk about it enough as much as developers do. So like without designing for consistency, you can actually end up with something like this. So Brad Frost actually, he calls these interface inventories, but he went through his bank's website and he took screenshots of like all the interface pieces, and this is just the buttons that were in this like single website. And so like when you see them all together like this, the inconsistencies are really obvious, and you're like, how does this happen, right? Like who could design something like this? But the truth is, like, this doesn't happen during a redesign. It happens over like long periods of time with different people making edits and updates and adding features. And like the designer who originally designed the site probably isn't even working on it anymore. Like, designers hand off their work all the time. And this could be attributed to a lot of things, like, oh, you know, timeline, like deadlines, like get it done, or, oh, egos, like this button sucks, I'm going to design this other button that's way better. But in most cases, I think it's just a lack of emphasis on consistency. And as a side note, like if you're working on an app or website, I definitely like recommend that you do this. Go through and like make an interface inventory. It's actually really awesome. And if you don't have a style guide, you should definitely push for one, even if you're not the designer on your project. Like push for consistency in the same way that you would with your development work. Hierarchy. So code organization, obviously super important for maintainable code, working code. You know, this is pretty simple for you guys, like parents, children, siblings, you get that, like global components narrowed down to page-specific components, like general to specific. And all of this translates really well to a hierarchy of an interface. So basically, interface organization, what you're doing is you're giving the user the right information on how to interact with your site. And so just, you could talk about a whole bunch of different things, but I like to think of like 3 simple rules. And the first is order. Basically, items that come first give the user context. They're usually things like global items like headers or navigation or important introductory information. Grouping. Grouping creates implied relationships between the items that you're grouping together. It makes things easier to read and to scan. Like in psychology, it's actually called chunking, which like items that are grouped together are easier to remember, and so your user can connect with your website in that way. And then size, of course, like visual size is an indicator of hierarchy. Like designers joke about the like clients saying like make the logo bigger. Like every client has said that like in every project, but it's true, right? Like larger size implies larger importance. Readability. So developers write code to be read by computers, but really great developers write code that's readable by humans. You know, if you're working on open source software, like you actually don't know like who's going to be on the other end of your code, like what their experience level is. What you want to do is make that code readable by a variety of people. And designing like readable text is kind of similar. There's a lot of things to consider, like typefaces, serifs, sans serifs, weights, you know, web fonts, anti-aliasing across browsers. It can be like super scary, even for like designers. Like that stuff makes me nervous too. But one thing that I always like to refer back to is your text editor. So it's something you're all familiar with. Basically think of like the text, like context highlighting in your text editor. You might have like personal settings that you have, but like the common defaults are high contrast text and obvious color differentiation, which basically gives, the color is used to give the words meaning, right? And so what this does is make your text super easy to read, and scanning makes it super easy. So in general, just ask yourself, is it readable? And keep this in mind during your design process. And I have like 3 quick rules that maybe might help. I don't know. I think these, if you stick with these, you're pretty good. And that's stick with high contrast. Low contrast can be readable still and have like some really nice subtlety to your design, but clarity is always better. Especially for like people that you won't know what their environment's like. They might have like low screen resolution or low lighting or be colorblind, right? So contrast is a great default. Up that font size. This is pretty obvious, but large text is generally easier to read. As a general rule, I like to say 16 pixels as a baseline. You can't go wrong with that. And then, like your text editor, use color to your advantage. Like differentiate links from body copy if you actually want like users to click on them. Color is an easy and really quick way to give the user context. So a really cool part of designing for the web right now is how few tools you actually need to get your site up and running. Like not even that long ago, you needed Photoshop to create a site that was like visually interesting. But now it's entirely possible to design like really badass websites with tools you're already using, which are your text editor and your browser, right? Like not even that long ago, to create a button with like gradients and rounded borders, you needed Photoshop. And now all of that's possible with HTML and CSS. And like designers are like depending less and less on like photo editing software and learning to design directly in the browser, and that's like your domain. Like you know all about that, right? So you should be comfortable with it. And these are iOS app icons, but they were actually built by Louis Harbo, and they're in HTML and CSS. You've probably seen other experiments like this. And this isn't like a super practical example because like you would never do this, but what this does show is what's possible, right? Like the browser itself is a design tool, a really powerful one. And I think like over the years, like somehow we've managed to equate like being good at Photoshop with being good at design, and that just like isn't the case anymore. Like you don't need mastery over another like suite of software to be an awesome designer. So let's do a really quick recap, went over a lot. Modularity, designing modular pieces that fit together to create a system. Reusability, you want to design components that can be reused in your app or in other apps. Consistency, reducing complexity. Hierarchy, giving the user the right context to interact with your site. Readability, designing so your content is easy to read and remember. And tools, your text editor and your browser are already your best friends. And so you might actually notice that there's something missing from this list, and that's visual design. And this is what most people think of when they say the word design. And so much so that like an entire app's interface will be called the design, right? And like bad visual design can totally ruin a great experience. And this is probably the part that developers think of when they say that they're not good designers. And so I definitely want to say that that's like not true. You're learning. Like you may not be as good as the designers you're working with or designer friends that you have, but that's okay. Like when you first started programming, you probably weren't like super awesome. And it takes a lot of practice to get better and learning from like the many mistakes that you're bound to make. So how many of you played with like Lego or something as a kid, or like took apart electronics and like built crazy shit out of the pieces, or you know, maybe you've been hacking on computers since like before floppy disks, whatever, I don't know. But basically a lot of developers have been like learning how to take things apart and build things and put them back together since like they were kids from a really early age. And it's the same thing with designers. They've been practicing the visual design part of their job since they were young too. Like for me, when I was a kid, I drew pictures just all day long. Like every year I'd like design birthday cards for my family. I'd like in school I created signage and like t-shirts and all of that stuff for our events. And then I ended up going to art school later. So things like composition, balance, and color all might seem like second nature to designers, and like you might even call it having like a natural eye, but really what it is, it's like the result of years and years of practice. And there's that saying, of course, like practice makes perfect, which like we all have problems with, but I think like practice really does make better. And don't get me wrong, there are those people that like will try something for the first time and be like amazing at it and like not struggle at all, but like that's actually pretty rare. Most people need to work on it, and so don't feel bad that you're learning. Like we've all been there, and it's important to do that. And just remember like how much practice you've had to have with programming and with JavaScript to get to the level that you're at now. So how do you find time? Like I know there's only so many hours in the day and so much focus you can give, and you're constantly working on like advancing your development skills, and like new tech comes out like every minute. And so I have a few recommendations for you, and the first is to start small. So try designing components within an already established system. Like it might be the app you're working on with your team, it might be a website that you've seen. I think actually a good way to do it is like just find a website or an app out there and like create some fake components for it. That might seem strange, but basically the point of that is you don't want to like wait until you have an active project or someone's paying you to do the work to start practicing. You need to practice all the time. So start off by biting off something small, like buttons, alerts, forms. Those are things that you can practice without taking up a huge chunk of your time. Like just take 5 minutes to 10 minutes every day to like try something. And what's nice about doing something within an already established system is that there's already a visual language that exists, and you're mimicking that style. And that might feel weird because you like might feel like you're taking someone else's work and like copying it and like calling it your own. But the truth is that like not every project is a redesign. A lot of the work that designers do within teams is like following the style decisions that another designer made previously, and that's okay. Because consistency, right? We talked about that. Like if you're working on a website that has tons of gradients and drop shadows, you don't want to drop in a feature that's completely flat, even though you might prefer that over the other. What your goal is to design something that's consistent and seamless. I redesign my personal portfolio like once a year, basically just for practice and learning. Like if you're constantly working on client work, or if you're working on the same app all the time, there's not a lot of room for experimentation or trying that new thing. Like when I was first introduced to responsive design, I went home and just redid my website with a responsive layout. And I'm glad I did, because where I was working, like our clients didn't start like even like talking about responsive design for like a couple years. And so if I had like waited for us to have a responsive design project, I would have missed out on all this like practice and experience that I gained just doing it on my own. And the good thing is that developers actually already do this already. Like I'm constantly seeing like GISs and little open source experiments and like code pens that are like just new techniques for shit that like already exists. Like you're just constantly making things better and learning, and you should do that with your design work too. And as a note, you should redesign often, I think, especially when you're learning. Like redesign your site every like 4 to 6 months. You know, it's something you can practice on, and it's pretty low pressure. And also you should do it quickly. Like designing for yourself can be tough, and so you definitely don't want it to like drag on forever. So just, you know, do it in like a week or 2 weeks, and that's it. And then like move on to the next time, you know, redo it right afterward, you know, just keep it quick and low pressure. So of the things I'm recommending that you try, this is probably the most outside of your comfort zone, and that's to draw something every day. And if you're ambitious, I think you should draw 2 things every day. I'm like, what on earth would you draw? That's crazy. So the first thing is something you can see, which is just whatever's around you, right? Like plants, a bookshelf, a poster on your wall, whatever. And the second thing is something you can imagine, and it doesn't have to be something like fantastical, like a unicorn, although that would be really awesome. It's more just like something that you're not physically looking at. So what would you draw with? I would just say that use tools that are comfortable for you. You could use like a pen and paper, you know, a mouse and a blank document, whatever. It's just you want to make it comfortable so that you'll do it. But start broad, right? Like 30 seconds to a minute, just sketch something. No pressure, right? Don't worry too much about details. And over time, you can like start to, as you become comfortable, you can start increasing the time of your sketches and the detail of your drawings. So draw something you can see and something you can imagine. And this might seem weird, like it's like the realm of like artists and illustrators, and not really all that related to like interface design and development. But this exercise isn't really about being a phenomenal drawer, although you might actually end up finding out that you are. The point of this essentially is to create a visual representation of what you see with your eyes and what you see with your mind, so others can see what you see. This is basically the like fundamental to visual design. And luckily it's a skill that you get better at with practice. And so for others essentially to see what you see, you have to show others your work, right? This part can be pretty difficult too. But when you draw your pictures, you should show someone. When you redesign your website, you should show someone and get feedback. It can be scary doing this, especially if things feel like unfinished, or like there's quick drawings you haven't like refined or like really even thought about, but that's actually a really perfect time to have someone look at it. This is a quote from a teammate of mine at Yet. His name's Michael Garvin, and it says, "Only those who are willing to take the risk of writing code that's not perfect ever write code." And I love this quote because it basically explains the anxiety that we all feel about showing our work to other people. Like, it is a risk. It takes courage to like put your work out there and have people like look at it, use it, and especially like to comment on it. And if you believe it or not, you're doing this like all the time with your development work. And so it can feel scary with design because it can be a little bit like fuzzier or like feels more subjective. But just remember that nothing's perfect, and you know, nothing ever is. So you're designing things and you want to show people, but like who do you show? The development open source community is pretty well established. It's actually really awesome. Like people are doing really awesome work and just sharing it with everybody, and they're getting contributions and feedback that really improve the product. And designers are starting to embrace this concept, but it's really unclear about like where to put your work or like how you can contribute. And so first step, I would say embrace existing online communities like Designer News or Dribble, wherever. Put your work out there and get feedback. These are places that are already established. Go to a designer meetup, connect with people. Find a designer that like gives thoughtful insight and honesty, and like throw your work at them and then encourage them to do the same to you. You as developers are in a really unique position right now to shape the design community around open source. We need your insights and experience, and I think a collaboration of that kind would be really awesome. It would improve your products, it would improve our work, and you have unique insights on that, and it's really cool. So let's do a really quick recap of what we just went over. So start small by creating small pieces that fit into an already established system. Redesign and recreate your personal portfolio or blog. Do it often. Draw something every day. Show your work to others and get feedback. And provide your unique insights to the design community and shape it. So I've talked a little bit about how developers can also be great designers and improve your design skills, and I hope that helps anyone who is like in that position, but maybe you don't want to be a designer, or maybe you have a team of like really talented designers already, and so you're more interested in like advice of like how to work with those designers. Like there's language barriers, you know, you say things differently, there's different interests, and I understand that, I've been there, there's complications that happen. And for these types of situations, essentially my advice would be exactly the same, and that's the best way to work with designers is to learn how to be a designer. This is a general rule that I kind of live by, which is every how to work with X person or talk, X person article or talk, can be summed up with understand them and appreciate them. Essentially the easiest way to work with others is to learn what they do, how they do it, and especially why they do it. Like, try to understand the obstacles that designers face. Like you might find out that you as developers are the ones that create those obstacles. Or if like a designer is constantly doing things that like make your job harder, like find out why. There might be a really important reason or there might not be. And either way you can learn and like figure out how to fix that problem. That insight can be like super awesome for collaboration. So think about making your designers' lives easier, appreciate their time, and they'll appreciate yours. And of course this isn't just about designers, like learning what your other teammates do makes you a better developer. Development isn't a single sport, right? Learning new skills and processes from your teams has this like really incredible ripple effect. Like the second you ask someone to help you learn, you've turned them into a teacher. And that's like super infectious, and like soon they'll actually be asking you to teach them. So designers as intentional developers. This could be like a talk or an entire conference on its own. And I know a lot of developers who would love to see more designers doing development work, or like some that like already expect it, right? But if this is something that you're pushing for, I would recommend that you take the first step. Be an intentional designer. And as a final thought, I just want to reiterate that you should stop apologizing for your design work. You're doing this, you're doing something and putting yourself out there and learning, and that's the hardest part, and you can't get better without it. Thank you.